Co-CEO Aaron Kaplan may have provided false testimony before Congress during a hearing on June 13th, when he said the company doesn't use resources from its Chinese affiliates as of December 2019. Tuberville pointed to the SEC filings from Prometheum in 2020 and 2021, which said the company relied on its Chinese partners. In fact, Tuberville pointed to a filing from Prometheum in 2020 that said losing its Chinese partner would have a material adverse effect on the company's ability to develop, operate, or maintain the Prometheum network. Now, in a statement to CNBC, Prometheum said it did not misrepresent its relationship with Wanxiang. The statement went on to say, quote, "We determined in early 2020 the co-development of technology was not viable, and in order to avoid corporate and litigation risk, sought to create value from our relationship." In its written testimony, Prometheum clearly states that joint development with Wanxiang and its affiliates formally ended in October 2021. Last, the UK's Financial Conduct Authority just revealed it shut down 26 crypto ATMs since the beginning of this year, citing unlawful operation as the cause. This comes after the agency announced its crackdown in February, issuing a warning that no crypto ATMs were registered by the UK as part of its anti-money laundering regulations and therefore were operating illegally. The new announcement emphasized the risk of losing deposits and that if something were to go wrong, it was unlikely that customers could get in touch with the ATM operator. As part of the announcement, the FCA's Joint Executive Director of Enforcement and Market Oversight said to crypto ATM users that you are using a machine that is operating illegally and you may be handing your money over to criminals. He also reiterated the FCA's commitment to continue taking action against unregistered crypto ATM operators. All right, on to our main story. As many countries pay close attention to the crypto industry, more and more central banks around the world are holding crypto too. Crypto World's Tanay McKeel spoke to Morgan Creek's Sachin Jaitley to have him explain the trend.
You've done this research showing 11 sovereign nations either hold or have held crypto in their central banks, with the US being the biggest holder. So you did this research, and I know that you can explain it, but I think that many would be surprised actually to hear that stat about the US. Can you tell us a little bit about Washington's Bitcoin holdings, why they have it, how they got it, what they're doing with it?
Yeah, no, happy to do that. As I suspect you and your audience well know, there is a element around Bitcoin, a discussion around Bitcoin as an inflationary hedge. And it includes properties that equal everything that gold can deliver, but few more properties that can enhance that asset and become a more effective hedge against inflation. So over the last decade, some nations, including the US, we're starting to obtain Bitcoin through seizure of illegal activities, right? So just to put a data point around this, one of the data analytics companies in our industry, Chain Analysis, reported that about 2% of all transactions are within illegal activity in our industry, or outside of our industry, I should say. And so those were obtained through governments. The US was no exception. They were starting to stockpile Bitcoin in our treasury over the past decade, since roughly 2014, 2015. And they came into quite a bit. So through that process, there was a discussion about, well, what is the US and other nations, by the way? I identified 11 nations that hold Bitcoin as a part of their treasury today, or have held. And so the discussion was, what are they going to do with this asset now that they have it? And there was different motivations from different nations around what they were going to do and why they were holding this asset. But in the US's perspective, my suspicion is that they wanted to hold on to this asset as it was increasing in value. It was in our national interest, it was in our national security to do so, and not have potentially other countries, perhaps even adversarial countries, obtain more of this asset than us.
We have heard, and like you said, we talk so much about this idea that Bitcoin is a hedge against inflation in the investing community. And I think that many investors in that community today find that narrative pretty debatable. So based on your research, what is it that that might be clicking for these central banks that's not quite clicking for investors on an individual basis? What are they seeing in that inflation narrative that some of us might be missing?
Sure. So I do want to be clear, although my research does support and showcase that there is statistical relationship between the increases in money supply, the increases in inflation, and sovereign adoption, there's other motivations at play. This is a multifaceted approach that many nations are taking, and there's no one cookie cutter kind of solve for all of this. But to answer your question, let's walk through. In my research, I've identified 5 different motivations for why nations are adopting. I'll just touch base on a few of them, right? I won't go through all of it. But one of the motivations are as a national competitive advantage. As I was describing earlier, if you ran a game theory analysis across 5 nations, let's just say the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the US, you would want to analyze how Bitcoin holdings would be adopted across those nations. You may want to understand of the assets that they have on hand today, would they want to sell off and allow other nations, in this analysis, other nations to obtain this asset that could be very valuable in the future. Another motivation is around as a dollarization or a reserve asset across the world. So countries that dollarize with the US dollar, there's many benefits to it, right? The US dollar is stable, it's globally accepted, and you can grow your economy with that as an emerging market. But there's downside to it as well. The downside is the US now has leverage in public policy negotiation with that emerging market. And we're seeing evidence that some nations don't want to have that leverage over their head. They are trying to deleverage within these public policy negotiations. And last but not least, another motivation here is around inflation and money supply as the driving forces around the adoption. So in my research, I was able to prove out that as money supply increases, as inflation increases, so too does cryptocurrency adoption. And in this case, I define cryptocurrency as Bitcoin. And something that's very important to note here is that sovereign governments around the world own about, let's call it a little bit less than 1% of all Bitcoin in circulation today. What's going to happen when that percentage goes to 2%? 3%, 4%, 5%, right? There's that seismic shifts in adoption around the world, and which would cause great demand for Bitcoin, which would cause price action as well.
Here at CNBC, we talk about the price, what's driving that, and what's driving price versus what's driving adoption. So I know you've said that inflation is a big overarching theme, and then there are some nuances by country, but how do we get to that seismic shift?
I think it's happening in real time. And let's just share some data points here, right? So the global population there's 3 categories: retail, corporate, and sovereign, in my opinion, right? And so on a retail level, we're talking about somewhere in the magnitude of about 3 to 5% of the world's population on a retail level own Bitcoin today, right? That is a significant number. On a corporate level, and I'm speaking specifically of publicly traded companies, there's roughly 40 companies today that own Bitcoin on their balance sheet. This includes the like of SpaceX, Tesla, Block, Grayscale, and many others, right? And it's important that we all are aware of this, right? This is happening. This is not just a theoretical construct that people are talking about. People are actually purchasing it and putting it on their balance sheet. And then we're talking about sovereigns. There is the population of sovereign countries is roughly, let's just call it 200 countries in the world. 11 of them today, we have been able to identify at least have hold or have held Bitcoin on their sovereign treasuries. Right? These are real numbers, right? That are not talking about something that's happening 10 years from now. This is happening today. And what we're seeing here, the headlines around the ETFs are only going to accelerate this trend. The headlines around nations in the world that are looking for alternative reserve assets, looking for alternative hedges against inflation, are taking place in real time, and those adoption cycles and themes are occurring.
Okay, that's all for Crypto World today. We'll be back again tomorrow, and we'll see you then.
Happy Friday and welcome to The Hash. You are watching us on CoinDesk TV. And if you're listening to us, you're listening on the CoinDesk Podcast Network. I'm Jen Sanasi here today with Will Foxley and Danny Nelson. Hello, guys. Welcome to the Free Box.
Danny, great
Always
to see you.
Great to have you, Danny. You are a fan favorite here on The Hash. Will, you got our first story.
I do. Let's talk about Gemini, which this story has been going on for a while. We have no resolution, but we do have some more antics, and that is that Gemini is going to sue Genesis in court. It's going to sue DCG founder Barry Silbert for alleging fraud. They, of course, owed $1.2 billion for the fallout after Genesis went into Chapter 11 filings. This all stemmed back from the collapse of Three Arrows Capital, a huge hedge fund that went under about a year ago, this time last year. And Three Arrows Capital had a lot of money out on loan from Genesis, and that went up the stack to DCG, which owns Genesis